I was halfway through repainting my shed when I heard the unmistakable sound of heels stabbing into my gravel driveway. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was her Sheryl Zenith, the HOA board secretary and self-declared protector of property aesthetics. She was the kind of woman who probably had a laminated copy of the neighborhood bylaws in her purse, next to a tape measure and a ruler. "Xander Avery," she snapped, arms folded tighter than a bank vault. "That structure is on HOA property. You're trespassing?" I set down my paintbrush and turned, eyeing the shed that had been there since before I bought the house 3 years ago. "You mean my shed?" "On my land," Sheryl's lips puckered like she just licked a lemon. "That shed extends 6 feet into the HOA's communal green space, which makes it ours. We'll be removing it." I laughed. Couldn't help it. "You're not touching anything on my land. I've got the plat map in my garage." "Want to see it?" "You're mistaken," she said, pulling out a crumpled paper with colored highlights and what looked like a child's drawing of a property line. "We had a survey done last week, and according to this, your shed is illegal." I wiped my hands on a rag. "Let me guess you paid for that survey with HOA funds." "Of course," she said proudly. "We're protecting the neighborhood." I raised an eyebrow. "From what? Storage sheds?" She stepped forward, heels crunching on gravel. "I'm giving you 72 hours to dismantle it voluntarily. If you don't, the HOA will send contractors." I wasn't going to entertain her circus anymore. I walked into my garage and came back with the original city-approved plat map I got when I bought the property. I handed it to her. Her eyes scanned it, and I watched her expression slowly shift from smug to confused to offended. "This can't be right," she muttered. "It is. That shed is 10 feet inside my property line. I even pulled the permits before building it." "You doctored this," she said, voice rising. "This isn't over." "Didn't think it would be," I said, walking back to my paint. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of hammering. I bolted outside in my slippers, and there they were, 2 guys in neon vests loading tools out of a truck with Zenith Property Services on the side. Sheryl stood next to them, arms crossed like a queen surveying her kingdom. I stormed over. "Get off my land." "These men are with the HOA," she said, holding up a clipboard like it meant something. "They're authorized to remove illegal structures." I pulled my phone out, dialed the sheriff's department, and reported an attempted trespass. Sheryl laughed, but it was nervous. "You're wasting the department's time," she snapped. "Nope," I said. "You're about to." While we waited, I made sure the workers didn't touch anything. They looked unsure and uncomfortable, clearly not in on whatever fantasy Sheryl was living in. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. Deputy Morales stepped out, a guy I'd chatted with a few times at the local diner. He walked up slowly, radio clipped to his vest, and gave Sheryl a long look before turning to me. "What's going on here, Xander? She's trying to remove my shed, claims it's HOA property." Morales turned to Sheryl. "Ma'am," she launched into her speech again, "illegal structure, HOA jurisdiction, community aesthetics." Morales listened for a minute, then held up a hand. "You got proof this shed's on HOA land?" She shoved her crayon map at him. Morales looked at it, then looked at me. I handed him my official plat map. After a few minutes of silent review, he looked back at her. "Ma'am, this document here's registered with the county. His shed's well within his property." "That can't be right," she shouted. "That's our land." Morales stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you and your workers to leave the property immediately. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to charge you with trespassing." Her jaw dropped. "You can't be serious." "I am, and if you come back again with another fake survey, bring a lawyer." Then the tears came. Sheryl actually started crying and muttering about ungrateful neighbors and how the HOA was just trying to help. Morales wasn't interested. "Off the property. Now." As they packed up, I turned back to my shed, still standing tall. I knew this wasn't the end of it. I'd seen the way Sheryl looked at me like a queen denied her throne. She'd be back. But so would I. 3 days after the sheriff escorted them off my property, I came back from a shift at the machine shop to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Violation notice. Unauthorized structure subject to fines and removal. No signature. No contact info, just the HOA letterhead bold and smug. I didn't even bother taking it down. I walked straight into my office, opened my file drawer, and pulled out the envelope I'd been prepping since Sheryl's last stunt. Certified copies of the property plat, the building permit, and the incident report Deputy Morales filed. Then I sat down and wrote a formal complaint to the county zoning board. If they wanted to play games, I was going to play chess. Later that night, I dropped the complaint off at the municipal building and made a few calls. One was to a buddy of mine, Charlie, who used to work in the city's land records office. The other was to a local journalist named Dana who ran a blog about shady HOA practices in the county. She'd been itching for a new story, and I was about to hand her a gift-wrapped one. The next afternoon, I noticed something strange. The neighborhood Facebook group, usually a sleepy place full of lost cat photos and bake sale announcements, was buzzing. Someone had posted a photo of a document labeled Emergency HOA Budget Reallocation, showing that over $20,000 had been moved into a new aesthetic enforcement fund. The name sounded like a joke, but the document was real. Sheryl's name was at the bottom, along with two other board members, Greg Luntz and Claudia Renner. Charlie called me that evening. "Xander," he said, "you're not going to believe this." I glanced through the HOA's registered survey files at the county office. That bogus map Sheryl showed the deputy. "It's not on file." "Of course it's not," I said. "She probably drew it with a ruler and a coloring book." "No, listen, it gets better. The HOA never filed for a new survey, not in the last 8 years, and the only official one on record matches your plat exactly." That was all I needed to hear. The following morning, I printed out everything: my plat, the fake violation notice, the HOA's budget reallocation, and the zoning complaint, and slid them all into a binder labeled Evidence. Then I walked over to my neighbor Larry's house. He was a retired detective who spent most of his time restoring old motorcycles. I figured if anyone knew how to sniff out fraud, it was him. He flipped through the binder, his expression darkening with every page. "They moved HOA funds into a private contractor account without a vote. Looks that way. And they tried to enforce a property seizure based on a fake map." "Yup," I said, crossing my arms. Larry set the binder down. "That's criminal misappropriation of funds and attempted property theft. You need to take this further. I know someone in the DA's office. Used to ride with me. I'll make a call." By sunset, I'd given a full statement to an investigator from the district attorney's public integrity unit. He asked for copies of my documentation, which I handed over without hesitation. As he was leaving, he said something that stuck with me. "If this checks out, they're not just looking at fines, they're looking at indictments." The next day, HOA President Greg Luntz tried to do damage control. He came to my door wearing a polo 2 sizes too tight and a forced grin. "Xander, I think there's been a bit of confusion," he said, glancing nervously at the orange notice still taped to my door. "Confusion's a funny word," I said. "You mean fraud?" He chuckled like we were old pals. "Let's not throw around accusations." "Look, Sheryl might have gotten a little overzealous. She tried to steal my shed." "Now, I wouldn't put it that way." "I would, and so would the DA's office." His smile vanished. "Listen, we don't want this to go public. It's bad for the whole neighborhood. You should have thought of that before fabricating a survey and reallocating money without a vote." He didn't respond, just turned and walked away, shoulders tight. 2 days later, the HOA board held an emergency meeting in the community clubhouse, and this time, half the neighborhood showed up. Word had spread fast. Dana from the blog had published her first piece. HOA Power Grab, Residents Fight Back Against Property Seizure Scheme. It had photos, quotes, and a copy of the fake violation notice. I showed up early, binder in hand. Larry came too, and so did Deputy Morales, off duty but curious. The board looked rattled. Claudia wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Greg kept checking his phone. Sheryl, though, was nowhere to be seen, As the meeting started, Greg cleared his throat and tried to launch into a speech about miscommunications and rebuilding trust. But the crowd wasn't having it. "Why wasn't there a vote about the budget reallocation?" someone shouted. "Where's the survey you claimed justified removing the shed?" another asked. I stood up and raised the binder. "I can answer that. There was no survey, and the money was moved without transparency or authorization. I've already spoken to the district attorney's office. They're investigating." A hush fell over the room. Greg looked like he'd swallowed a nail, then Larry stepped forward. "I've reviewed the documents. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculated. And if the board doesn't resign voluntarily, we'll pursue a recall vote. The bylaws allow it." People started clapping. Not cheering, just steady, determined applause, the kind that meant they'd had enough. Greg tried to speak again, but no one was listening. Claudia got up and left first. Then Greg followed, muttering something under his breath. Still no sign of Sheryl. The next morning, a police cruiser and 2 unmarked vehicles pulled up outside her house. An officer knocked on her door, and moments later, she stepped out in a robe and slippers, visibly shaking. I watched from my porch as they read her something from a folder and placed her in handcuffs. She didn't argue. She didn't yell. She just collapsed into tears. The neighborhood watched in silence. No one said a word. Later, Morales stopped by. "They're charging her with attempted fraud, misuse of HOA funds, and false filing of an official document," he said. "The DA's office might go after the others too." I nodded. "Good. You ever think about running for the board?" he asked. I laughed. "I'd rather build another shed." But privately, I was already thinking about what we could do with a clean slate. No more secret meetings, no more power games, just neighbors working together. And if anyone ever tried pulling a stunt like that again, they'd know exactly whose driveway not to step on. I didn't see Sheryl for a week after the arrest. Her house sat dark, the curtains drawn tight like it was bracing for a storm. But even with her out of sight, the fallout from her little stunt was just getting started. Word had spread far beyond our neighborhood. Dana's blog post had been picked up by a regional news outlet, and suddenly, my quiet street had become the symbol of homeowners standing up to corrupt HOA boards. A local radio host even called it the shed that broke the board. But I wasn't celebrating yet. Not when I got an envelope in the mail marked summons. Greg and Claudia had lawyered up and were trying to delay the investigation by claiming the HOA board acted in good faith. According to their attorney, the board had reasonable cause to believe my shed encroached on common land. Never mind the actual documents that proved otherwise. I brought the summons to my lawyer, a sharp former city prosecutor named Julia Finch. She had the kind of demeanor that made court clerks straighten their spines and opposing counsel rethink their strategies. "They're stalling," she said, flipping through the packet, "trying to muddy the waters before the audit hits." "What audit?" Julia tapped a paperclip with her pen. "The county controller just opened an inquiry into the HOA's financial records. A formal audit's been ordered. If they find evidence of embezzlement or falsified expenses, we're talking felony charges." I leaned back in the chair. "And this lawsuit? They won't see a dime, but it tells me they're scared." While Julia handled the legal side, I turned my attention to something else, the HOA bylaws. I got a copy from the county clerk's office and started reading every line, highlighting anything that looked like it had been ignored. It didn't take long to find a few gems, like a clause requiring all financial reallocations over $5,000 to be approved by a 2/3 vote of homeowners. Not only had that vote never happened, but the meeting minutes from the last 3 months made no mention of the Aesthetic Enforcement Fund at all. At the next community meeting, now led by a temporary acting board, I stood up with my copy of the bylaws. "Page 32, I said. "Section 7, paragraph 4. Any spending over $5,000 requires a homeowner vote. That never happened, which means every dollar spent trying to remove my shed was illegal." A few neighbors nodded. One woman, Denise, raised her hand. "I didn't even know they'd moved that much money." We never got a notice. They didn't want you to know, I said. They were counting on no one looking. That night, I received a call from Detective Mara Holloway with the county's Financial Crimes Unit. She was investigating the audit findings and wanted to ask a few questions about the board's spending patterns. They wrote checks to a company called Zenith Property Services, she said. It's not listed with the state, no business license, no tax records. I blinked. That's the company that showed up to tear down my shed. Well, here's the kicker, Detective Holloway said. The registered address for Zenith Property Services is the same as Sheryl Zenith's home. There was a silence. Then I let out a low whistle. So she created a fake company, billed the HOA, and used the money to pay herself. Looks that way. We're filing charges. Wire fraud, falsifying business documents, and theft by deception. The next day, I got a text from Larry. Come outside now. I stepped onto the porch and spotted 2 unmarked vehicles parked in front of Sheryl's house. This time, the officers weren't there to talk. They carried boxes and evidence bags. One of them brought out a desktop computer wrapped in plastic. Another carried a stack of binders with sticky notes poking out like porcupine quills. A third officer followed with a checkbook. The cover read, Zenith Property Services. Larry walked over, arms crossed. You think she actually thought she'd get away with it? She probably thought no one would look past the clipboard. Later that evening, the acting board held an emergency session in the clubhouse and invited every resident. People filled the folding chairs, some standing along the walls. I sat in the back, binder in hand, but I didn't speak this time. I didn't need to. The acting president, a quiet woman named Evelyn Marks, stepped up to the mic. We've received confirmation tonight that the former HOA secretary, Sheryl Zenith, has been charged with multiple felonies, including theft and fraud. The county audit also found that over $19,000 was misappropriated from HOA funds and funneled into a shell company under her name. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Evelyn continued, her voice steady. The board members who failed to disclose or challenge these expenditures, Greg Luntz and Claudia Renner, have both resigned. The county has barred them from serving on any registered HOA board pending the outcome of the investigation. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Good riddance." Evelyn raised a hand. We're moving forward. A full financial transparency program is being implemented. All spending over $1,000 will be documented and posted publicly. All board meetings will be recorded and made available online. And next month, we'll hold a special election to fill the vacant board seats. The meeting ended with applause, not the sarcastic kind, but something close to relief. For the first time since this mess started, the neighborhood felt like it was breathing again. By the following week, I noticed something I hadn't seen in months. People were talking to each other, not in whispers or side eyes, but real conversations. Neighbors stopped me on the street not to complain, but to ask how I'd managed to hold the board accountable. A few even asked if I'd consider running for the new board. I gave them all the same answer. I'd rather keep building things in my backyard. Still, I didn't stay out of it entirely. I helped Evelyn draft a new amendment to the bylaws requiring mandatory third-party audits every 2 years and a homeowner oversight committee to review all major expenditures. I didn't want to sit at the table, but I'd happily help flip it if someone started playing dirty again. A week before the election, I walked past the clubhouse and saw a group of kids painting a mural on the side wall. A community project Evelyn had started, neighbors contributing time instead of fees. As I stood watching, one of the kids pointed at my shed across the street. "That's the one, right?" he asked. "The famous shed?" I laughed. "Yeah, that's the one," he nodded, then went back to painting. A skyline, a tree, a house. Then he added a little red shed at the edge of the mural. It wasn't much, just a few strokes of paint, but it felt like a tribute. As I walked back home, I passed Sheryl's house. The for sale sign had gone up that morning. No takers yet, and probably none for a while. Word had gotten around. I stepped onto my porch, looked out at the street, and felt something I hadn't in months: peace. Not because my shed was still standing, but because people finally saw what happens when you stand your ground. When you don't let bullies rewrite the rules. When you fight back smart and steady with the truth on your side. And if anyone else ever came around with a clipboard and a fake survey, they'd know exactly how far that would get them on this street. The morning of the special HOA election felt more like a block party than a vote. Folding tables lined the sidewalk in front of the clubhouse. Neighbors brought baked goods, and someone had set up a portable speaker playing old blues tracks under the shade of a maple tree. Kids ran between lawn chairs while parents chatted in small groups, watching the ballot box like it was a bonfire. I wasn't running, but Evelyn had convinced me to help count votes alongside a retired school principal and a local librarian named Terrence, who insisted on wearing white gloves for dignity. It was the most civil thing I'd seen happen under this HOA's watch in years. By late afternoon, the results were in. 3 new board members, all longtime residents with no patience for power grabs. The only thing they promised during their brief speeches was transparency and a permanent end to discretionary spending without homeowner input. There wasn't a single mention of aesthetic enforcement. No one clapped louder than Denise when they announced that phrase would be erased from the bylaws entirely. Around dusk, I returned home, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could finally get back to repainting the shed without incident. I was wrong. As I turned the corner onto my street, I saw a black SUV idling in front of Sheryl's house. A man in a gray suit stood at the front door, clipboard pressed to his side. He knocked twice, waited, then walked back to his vehicle and drove off. I wouldn't have thought much of it if I hadn't recognized the county seal on the folder he was holding. That night, I got a call from Julia. "They're expanding the investigation," she said. "Turns out Sheryl didn't just fabricate a company. She submitted fake invoices to the HOA for landscaping and security upgrades that never happened." I felt my hand tighten around the phone, so it went deeper than the shed stunt. Much deeper. The county's Financial Crimes Division believes she embezzled over $30,000 during her time on the board. That's money collected from residents through fees gone. My jaw clenched. How's that even possible without someone noticing? "They're looking into collusion," she said. "There's evidence that Greg approved those invoices without review. Claudia signed off on at least 2 checks that don't match any corresponding work completed." I stepped outside onto the porch, the evening air thick with the scent of cut grass and charcoal from someone's backyard grill. "You think there's a chance they'll all see jail time, if the charges stick, and from what I've seen, they will, yes." The next morning, 3 unmarked cars returned to Sheryl's property, this time escorting a woman from the district attorney's office. She knocked once, then entered with a search warrant in hand. They didn't take her away in cuffs this time. She was already out on bail, but they seized 3 file boxes and her desktop computer. The neighbors didn't gather like they did the first time. No one needed the spectacle again. The damage had already been done. When I walked past later, I saw a real estate agent standing on the porch, flipping through listings on a tablet. She looked up and gave me a brief nod. "She's selling at a loss," the agent said, not even pretending to whisper. "No one wants to buy into a scandal." I didn't respond, just kept walking. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the county courthouse. I was being asked to testify in a grand jury proceeding. The charges against Sheryl included embezzlement, falsification of municipal records, and conspiracy to defraud. Greg and Claudia were named as co-conspirators. I met with the assistant district attorney in a quiet office downtown. He was a lean man with a receding hairline and a voice like a file scraping wood. He laid out the timeline, asked for clarification on a few events, then handed me a copy of the original HOA violation notice for the shed. "This one's important," he said. "It proves she attempted to weaponize her authority under false pretenses." He also showed me a ledger recovered from Sheryl's home. It listed dozens of transactions, none of which matched the actual HOA budget reports. There were payments to non-existent vendors, inflated costs for landscaping, and 3 separate entries labeled consulting with no further explanation. She didn't just bend the rules, he said. She rewrote them and hoped no one would look under the rug. The grand jury met at the end of the week. I spent 20 minutes on the stand answering questions simply and clearly. When I left, the ADA gave me a firm nod. "We'll be indicting all 3, he said. The evidence speaks for itself. When the indictments were unsealed, it made the evening news. Not just the local station, either a regional segment ran a feature titled HOA or Hustle, When Neighborhood Power Turns Criminal. Dana's blog doubled in readership overnight. She even started a podcast. But I wasn't interested in the spotlight. I was interested in fixing what had been broken. Over the next month, the new board got to work. They refunded a portion of HOA fees to every household using recovered funds. They hired a licensed accountant to maintain the books, and every resident was given login access to view real-time spending. A new rule required that all vendors be verified through the county's contractor registry. No more fake landscapers. No more phantom painters. One Saturday morning, I was out front planting a small row of hedges when Evelyn stopped by with a paper cup of coffee and a folded newsletter. "I figured you'd want the first copy," she said. "We're calling it the Ledger." I unfolded it. Inside were updates on board decisions, upcoming projects, and a full financial statement. At the bottom was a small section titled Community Spotlights, and beneath that, a photo of my shed freshly painted with deep green trim. I looked at Evelyn. "You know I didn't do this for recognition, right?" She gave a small shrug. "We know, but sometimes people need to be reminded that standing up matters." As summer crept in, the neighborhood changed, not dramatically, not overnight. But in small ways, neighbors talking longer at the mailbox, kids playing in driveways without being told to keep out of sight, people planting gardens without worrying about uniform mulch colors. The new board didn't issue fines. They issued invitations to help with cleanup days and community events. One evening, I was walking my dog past the clubhouse and saw a group of teenagers repainting the sign out front. The old metal letters that once read Oak Point HOA had been replaced with wooden ones that simply said Oak Point Neighborhood. No board titles, no acronyms, just people. On the way back, I passed Sheryl's house. The for sale sign had been taken down. The curtains still hung closed, but someone had mown the lawn. It looked like whoever bought it had no intention of picking fights with neighbors over sheds. I stopped at the edge of my gravel driveway and looked at the shed one last time. It stood exactly where it always had, unmoved, unbothered, and now freshly repainted with a small weather vane on top shaped like a hawk. It wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a landmark. A line in the dirt no one crossed again. I picked up my rake, turned back to the garden bed, and got to work. There was nothing left to fight. Not today, and that was just fine.